Okay, this is another sample of a log that they hollowed out, and they filled it with salt for preserving. And these are the gourds that they had that are in here drying, and they would use those to store things in, even water, because they would be waterproof, but they would cut the tops off so they could be used like as jars. Okay?
What are these?
Oh, these are preserves. These are just samples of some preserves, and they did have some things at the grocery store that you could buy tins of, but most people didn't have any money, and it was, like I said, it was very difficult to get to a store, so most people did not have tins of food. Okay, and this is an old iron. Since they didn't have electricity, they used to have to heat that iron in the fire and get it very hot, and then they would smooth it over the clothes to get most of the wrinkles out. This is a primitive washing machine. They started out where they used to have to wash in the creek using these washboards. And then they advanced to things like this, where they would pull that crank back and forth and it would swish it around in water. Then they advanced to something like this, which would boil the water and it would be stirred with that. Actually, Jack, I don't really know what it did. It was an advancement in the way of a washing machine.
Industrial Revolution.
Yes, that helped, and they were happy with it. Let's put it that way.
Wait, the one.
Oh, this is a lard press. So when they would slaughter a pig, they used to put the pig fat inside this, and then they would take this big screw and they would squish it down, and they would separate the solid from the liquid, because they would use fats for different things. You know how you have to have oil for cooking? Well, they would also use the lard for different things too for cooking.
Tell me the fact about that.
About what?
That one.
I just did. This is the washing machine. These would be some of the quilts and material that they would make from the leftover material that they had, or clothing. These are the quilts where they would take the good portions of the clothing that they wore and they would sew them into quilts. This was a basket when somebody was out walking in the field and they would come up to fences. Sometimes the sheep would rub against the fence, and they would leave a little bit of wool, and they used to gather it. So that was called gathering baskets for the wool. And these again are just samples of cotton, wool, and the spinning wheels that they used. This, the round thing with the wick in it, they used to put oil in that, and then they would light that piece of string or twine, and that would be a way of lighting a room. They put in burnt lard, or they would have grease, and it was very dirty. It would have been a very dirty
What is
thing.
this?
It was before kerosene. That's a gas lamp lighter, and let's see, that said it was from 1851. 1851. But kerosene was developed in 1854, and it says it surpassed previous lighting fuels. It was brighter and cheaper and was cleaner. So this thing that they would use for the lard or the grease made their house very dirty and smelly. So kerosene was a good invention.
What is this?
That's a sewing machine. They don't have the machine on the top, but that would have been an old Singer sewing machine. And this thing on the bottom is what they would push to make it go. For the motor, they used to have to use their feet. These are some of the things that a woman would use. That thing that looks like a scissors, they would heat that up and that would crimp their hair. It was like an early version of a curling iron. Okay, and this is like a little scope where they would put a picture in there and it would make it look like it was three-dimensional. Because they didn't have TVs back then. You couldn't, this was like a little bit of an entertainment. Okay. And we'll come over here for the milk. These are old milk jugs. And that thing that looks like a gun, they had all of these little round pieces of cardboard on there, and they would shoot those from that gun. They would be shot into these jars after they were filled with milk, and that would seal them shut.
What is a milk fever treatment kit?
Oh, well, that would have been if the cow got sick, they would have to treat them for milk fever, so that's what a veterinary clinic would use. And then this is a bell that they used to wear around the cow so that the farmer would know where the cow was. This is a milk tester. They would test for the butterfat content of the milk for the cows, the farmers. These are butter churns. These are various forms of butter churns. The bigger ones, of course, made more butter. This was a primitive way of getting the cream from the milk to rise. They used to put them in shallow bowls. That's just a real shallow wooden bowl, and they'd let it sit, and then the cream would rise to the top. They would churn that into butter, and these are the molds. If they wanted to make their butter look pretty, they could put them into butter molds. Well, they eventually advanced where they would put all the milk into that top portion, and then it would separate into two different buckets. Somehow the thing inside there was able to separate the cream right away from the milk, so they could do it much faster, and then they could produce more milk and more cream because it was a faster way to do it. I don't know how it did it, but that's what that was.
What is this?
This is another butter churn. This is just another way of doing it. This butter churn is for very large amounts. They had to get the buttermilk out of the butter once it was made, so they would take this thing and rub it across this, going back and forth to get all that milk out of it. So once they churned the butter, they still had to get it solidified, and this was for big ones. That's probably what this did, Jack. Once they got it, I bet you they put the butter in there and they were able to squish the liquids out. That's probably what that was. Okay. Alright, this is another form of a butter churn. It was a double butter churn. And here are some samples of irons. And this is another spider kettle where they could do all their cooking. And they could flip the top of the spider kettle over and they could fry on it. And this is a dried gourd that they could use to store things in their crocks. And they had a lot of cast iron that they would bake in. These are sunflowers that they would pick, and they would use the seeds for cooking or just eating. These crocks, they most likely stored flour and salt and sugar, things that they would have to buy at the store, and they put the material over it to keep the rodents and the insects out.
Wait, this.
These are little cast iron pans that they would use to make their cornmeal. They would make individual servings of cornmeal. And these are crocks that they would use to store things in.
What is that?
That's a grinder where they would grind up their herbs or corn into flour. And these are some of the medicines that they would use. And these are the dried green beans and dried herbs that they would keep so that the housewife had them at her fingertips. And the beans, of course, were so that nothing went to waste. And this would have been a handmade high chair for a little baby. And here are more herbs. And here to show you, see, they didn't eat as much food as we did. Those are their little biscuits. See how tiny they are compared to what we eat. And handmade wooden bowls. And that's a sunflower, and this is another churn. See, you use your feet to make that butter churn work. This is their tiny little pantry. And today I think we call these pie, I think your mom has one. I think they're called like pie boxes or something, but they have the holes. They have those little holes in the tin, and that's so that they could put in their hot pies and bread, shut the doors, and keep all the insects off, but still ventilate it so that it wouldn't get all soggy. And I think that's why they called them that. This family would have been lucky because they didn't have to cook on the stove or on the fire. This was a stove, and this big part, they would put the fire in there to heat it up, and they could cook on this stove. And these are some crocks and cooking utensils that they would have.
What is this?
This would be a butter churn. And they would churn it into that crock. This piece of metal was, they made the holes with the nail going through, and then they would rub nuts against it, and that would be a way to grind the nuts for spices. And that's a way that they could chop herbs. They would put them inside there and chop them with that little pole. And this is just an old cookbook. I'm not sure when that cookbook was made, but it's a real old cookbook.